So far last night and earlier this week, what I would call the various estates or pillars of our system of governance have been scrutinised and discussed here. The first estate being the government, and that's been dealt with last night and again today. The second estate, the Dáil and the Seanad. Last night by Fintan O'Toole and this evening by Justine, the legal system, the judiciary. And in the argy-bargy last night, the fourth estate, the media, got some airing. And today, in my session, I'm going to deal with what Joe asked me to deal with, is the reform of the fifth estate, meaning the reform of the civil service. What do I do here to pass this on?
Just press that.
Press that one. Okay, yeah, thanks very much. So the idea of the fifth estate, the senior civil service being the fifth estate, is an idea I think that we should hold on to. It was aired recently in a speech in NUI Galway by the esteemed former civil servant Maurice Hayes, where he said that a permanent civil service is an indispensable balancing mechanism, an important fifth estate in Irish governance. He remarked that it was not mentioned in the Constitution because De Valera did not want to concede that role. Okay, thanks. De Valera forbade senior civil servants to congregate, so that from the outset, the emergence of a fully formed, properly endowed and legally protected fifth estate was stymied. And the country has been at a loss because of that ever since. Any estate, the judiciary, the Dáil, the Seanad, the media, any estate fails in its unique, indispensable balancing role if it's controlled or compromised by another estate, such as, for example, the fear that the British government had of the Murdoch media empire. And also, to the degree that the civil service prioritises personal, party political and other vested interests over the public interest, it has failed the nation. And I'm sad to say, and we all know it, on matters of vital national interest, Ireland's fifth estate, as Maurice Hayes put it, failed to act as a brake on autocracy. We were let down by the fifth estate. Now, one of the reasons that the fifth estate let us down, a fundamental reason, is because it is joined at the hip to the government. The Ministers and Secretaries Act of 1924, which has been mentioned several times so far this week, conflates the roles and responsibilities of ministers and secretaries general and senior officials so that neither of them can be held accountable. We know the story of the minister who says, I acted on the advice of my officials, and the officials are barred by law from saying what that advice was. So neither of them can be held accountable. Now, this is well understood today by a new group of senior civil servants who I believe are emerging. And I will quote to you the first opening sentence from a working paper that's currently at an advanced stage in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. It reads, "Robust and effective accountability arrangements for civil servants are an essential prerequisite to the creation of a high-performing civil service. But there are serious deficits in the current arrangements." This is a group of senior civil servants saying there are fundamental deficits in the arrangements for holding us accountable. Now, it is vital, in my view, that this game-changing work that's going on is brought to a conclusion by senior civil servants in their own interests and in the public interest, without it being compromised on political grounds. So, in the first instance, what we need is a fully fledged fifth estate, properly constituted, legally protected, to uncouple it, if you like, and put a degree of blue water between the government and the civil service. So let's assume that that materialises. I now want to talk about the reform of that fifth estate. I'll pick up on the Haddington Road Agreement. The Haddington Road Agreement was a remarkable achievement by public service management and unions. It was remarkable because what it involved was painful pay cuts and longer working hours. That's it in essence. And serious pay cuts at the more senior levels, which haven't happened before. Now, Mr. Howland, very conscious of the pain that was being inflicted by this agreement, said to people to allay their worst fears, "This will be the last ask. We will not be coming back again." But he made careful to say that it's the last ask for pay cuts, and he added that the new savings will come from what he called widespread work practice reforms. Now, just to clear with some terminology, it may be helpful. Croke Park and Haddington Road were essentially cost-cutting to meet certain fiscal targets, and huge collateral damage has been done to services, to the skill base of the civil service in achieving those cost cuts. What is not widely known at all is 14 major programs which are being mapped out and now driven by a dedicated, specialised team within the new Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, to do with shared services, property, procurement, mergers of quangos, putting services online, using IT, and so on. Now, I would describe these programs as modernisation. They essentially amount to the civil and public service catching up with best practice in the private sector and indeed with parts of the public sector. This is the program that was supposed to have been done after benchmarking a decade ago, but thank goodness it is on its way, and give credit where it's due to the team that's doing it. The third big chunk, so we've cost-cutting and we've modernisation. We're only beginning to scratch the surface on what I would call reform, and I want to reserve the word reform for the restoration of the integrity and the culture of the civil service. So the next big asks are what I call deep structural and cultural change, and I'll mention four major structural changes which constitute very big new asks. The first one I'll describe as disruptive innovation. And disruptive innovation is what Mr. Howland referred to when he referred to widespread work practice reform. Now, I'm only going to give you two examples. I'm involved in an organisation called Genio, and what we do is we move people with disabilities from what's called congregated or institutional settings into individualised solutions in the community. And over a large number of cases, the average cost of the institutional care is $79,000. The average cost of the community care solution is $25,000. And crucially, the outcomes and quality of life for the people are hugely enhanced in the community care setting. Another example is a comparison of cardiovascular care in two Galway hospitals. In one of them, the average cost over a set of procedures is nearly $23,000. In the other case, it's $6,500. Now, this is why I describe this as disruptive. In the Galway hospital, which cost $3,000, they're saddled with the inherited demarcations, grades, and roles. And there are about 10 different categories of jobs, each of them with their own turf and their own need to protect their own roles. In the more cost-effective one, you've only 4 roles. So there are huge disruptive challenges facing staff in all of these institutions, and also for the professional bodies that represent them. And as again, in the hospital again, the better care outcomes come from the cheaper costs. Now, this is coming to all sectors, higher education, and so on. So very big asks in prospect in the public service. The second big structural change has to do with contestability or competition. I'll keep this very straight. Monopolies, public or private, do not serve the public interest. There has to be an end to the monopolies activity by the public service. And they have to be, most public service activity has to be open to competition. But it is not enough to get the market to care for people. So there's no point outsourcing, as they call it, childcare, nursing home care and the likes, and then not having good regulation. If you listen carefully today to the story from Denmark, the story there is that the state is not a big actor in many of these areas, but it is a good regulator in these areas. And what we do is we privatise provincial buses or we privatise childcare, but then we don't have good regulation. The two have to go together. That's a huge, big ask for the public service. The third big area, it has been mentioned by every speaker practically here so far. It is accountability with consequences. Now, we could talk all night about this, but I'll cut to the chase with just one example. Most of you will have seen the RTE expose of the cruelty towards infant children in the creches. And one of the women who was seen slapping the child down and throwing a blanket over it, she was sacked. Great stuff. Well, she was on €10 an hour, untrained, managing too many children and unsupervised. Now, this will go down as another systems problem. But there is no accountability with consequences, such as being sacked, for managers, boards or ministers who are responsible for ensuring the good systems. They're paid 100 or 200,000 euro to ensure there are good systems, but they're not held accountable. And again, the story from Denmark was illuminating on that this afternoon. Ministers can get sacked for something that was a systems problem. They can't just write it away. There is in Ireland a culture of managerial and political impunity, and the higher up you are, the more the impunity prevails. Even to the extent that when it comes to the crunch, perjury in this country is not treated as a crime. Fourth big structural change, and I place a lot of hopes on this, is the establishment of what's called a senior public service. That's a cohort of the mandarins, if you like, at the very top. Because the legacy that they have to overcome is one of reliance on gifted generalists, a distrust of outsiders, weak management skills, flawed structures of accountability, as I mentioned, and ministerial and civil servant roles conflated. The comparisons have been drawn with the French system, the New Zealand system, but we do not have a senior public service. In fact, it's every man for himself up there. One current Secretary General told me, I have never received one day's training in management. And he's a budget of about $1 billion and a staff of about 1,000. Now, I now want to get to something that I feel very passionately about, and it's the issue of cultural reform. Before he died, Gareth Fitzgerald's last two articles said that the root cause of institutional failures in this country was a failure of morals, ethics, values. It was a moral or cultural failure. And a spate of inquiries that have looked back at the 10 years from about the 90s to 2010, last 2 decades, were just a litany of revelations about dysfunctional cultures in the public service. Here are some of the terms that have been used in these reports. A culture of cover-up and collusion, a culture of deference and timidity, a culture of incompetence, secrecy, obstruction, perks and entitlements, a culture of extravagance, a culture of impunity, loss of moral compass. Now, there can be no genuine institutional reform without cultural reform. I have a list, and I've added 2 more to the list, of the number of times where we've had institutional failure, where authoritative commentators have said there can be no reform here unless we get the culture changed. In hospitals, Sir Kenneth Pearson, chairman of Tala Hospital. In banking, Matthew Elderfield has said this. Emily Logan in the domain of children. In the Catholic Church, Andy Kenny and Dermot Martin. In the mental health services. A fortnight ago, the juvenile prison St. Pat's, a sadistic culture that violated the human rights of children. Justine has just referred to the culture of the legal system. This culture thing, we have to face it as a crucial issue that has to be addressed. And it's no different in the public service. In 2008, the OECD said the greatest resource of the public service is its core values. And governments have found it crucial to restate traditional and new values to provide an ethical framework for staff to be established in their hearts and minds. It was a recommendation in 2008 and it has not been picked up. So, as I've said, a pivotal initiative to do with the reform of the public service is the creation of that leadership cohort at the top. And that has already begun. And in the working paper on that issue, the formation of a senior public service, they have named the core values of our public service. For the first time, the core values to which you subscribe have actually been written down. I won't go through them all. Honesty, integrity, courage, personal accountability, protecting the public interest. Now, naming your core values is only the first step. AIB named its core values. You could find them in every statement of strategy. The central bank and the regulator declared their core values. I was the consultant involved in helping them to crystallize those core values. The mental health services have declined the core values. So publishing your core values is only an ornament until they are embedded, as the OECD said, in the hearts and minds of all staff. And I want to illustrate this with the metaphor of an iceberg. Above the surface of that iceberg, you have Croke Park, Paddington Road, and the 14 programmes of the Department of Expenditure and Reform. pay cuts, longer hours, smarter procurement, rationalisation of property, new rules and regulations, FOI, lobbying, ethics, new codes of ethics. They are not worth the paper they're written on unless you deal with what's below the line. The mindset of the people, their values, their attitude to those laws. When Bertie Ahern, for example, was asked about ethics, he said, the only ethics is the ethics of being re-elected. We have had lots of rules and regulations, but as we know, people have given them the two fingers, they have avoided them. So you can put in all the infrastructure you like above the line, unless you deal with what's below that line, you're not going to get the reform. We will revert to type. Now, there has been some progress on this. One of the 5 strategic objectives in the Taoiseach's statement of strategy in his department is restoration of trust in the institutions of state. As I've mentioned, there's the game-changing proposals on addressing serious deficits and accountability. There's work on the senior public service, and we have a number of bills in the pipeline to do with ethics and lobbying and FOI. But these are all above the surface. They will not deliver. We can add to those as much as you like unless you deal with it below the surface. So yes, indeed, we have made some progress on cultural reform, but the public service, our fifth estate, is still vulnerable to capture and compromise by the political system. The value system of the Haughey Ahern era, which compromised the civil service, has not been fully exercised. If you want a parallel of the vulnerability that we still face, if you look at the Catholic Church, for example, where Vatican II heralded a whole new dawn, and a lot of people had great hopes on that. Very quickly, it was hijacked by conservative forces, and the Church reverted type as a conservative organisation. Here's a key question that we have to ask public servants as a measure of whether or not the culture has changed. Are they consistently placing the public interest ahead of protecting ministers? And my answer is no. Today still, senior public servants are routinely forfeiting the public interest, such as the right to know, in order to protect the minister. If you want a very good example of it, I believe ministers and officials colluded to try to give us the explanation for the location of primary care systems by asking consenting adults like in this room to accept that the choices were made on the basis of logistical logarithmic progressions. The point I'm making is embedded cultures are tenacious, and the empire can strike back at any time. That's not paranoia, that's about being vigilant. So, in summary, Haddington Road and Croke Park have been about cuts. They needed to be done, but they've done terrible damage to the public service. The 14 Department of Public Expenditure Reform programs are about modernisation. Now, making cuts is a relatively simple administrative process. But what's now needed are deep structural and cultural reform, and that will involve heavy lifting. And the heavy lifting will involve disruptive structural innovation, such as I illustrated earlier in relation to hospitals, disability, higher education, and so on. The end of public service monopolies, plus you have to put in good regulation. Personal accountability with consequences, and cultural renewal in the hearts and minds of staff of the public service. And finally, I am placing a lot of hope on the emergence of a senior public service that is competent, ethical and accountable, and that will give the leadership that is needed to reform the public service. I think there's movement happening, there's credit due to the people who are doing it, but it's far too early to celebrate success. There's a long way to go. And the experience I've had with large-scale institutions tells me that this is a 10-year program. We need a vision, but it needs to be worked out year in, year out, relentlessly. And since we had the Croke Park Agreement, to call the first one, and the second one was called the Haddington Road Agreement, I've been looking around for the correct name to call this final agreement. And I'll suggest that it should be called the Long Mile Road Agreement. Thanks very much.